Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for joining us for one of our talks today. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by Joshua Rofé, who is the director of the series Sasquatch, currently airing on Hulu. And I'm so fascinated by the genesis of this and the fact that it began with you listening to a podcast series called Sasquatch Chronicles and having the idea of, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a murder mystery story that tied into this, and how you then reached out to David and kind of ultimately manifested what this series ended up becoming. So I just wanted to ask about the manifestation of having this idea percolate, and how through conversations with David, it then became a reality in a 3-part series.
Yeah, so February 2018, I was making my previous series, which is called Lorena. It's about the Lorena Bobbitt story. And, you know, during even the early days of making that, I was sort of amazed by how much archival material existed. And I felt so fortunate that we were finding it, and it was all there to help tell the story. But I also started to think, well, what if you tried to make a doc where there's no not only is there seemingly no archival, you can't even Google the story, you know? And so that was a little sort of bug in my ear. And then I had dinner with a friend. His name's Zach Kreger. He's one of the exec producers on this show. And his parting words to me at the end of dinner were, by the way, I really want you to listen to this podcast, Sasquatch Chronicles. You're either going to love it or think I'm crazy for loving it. And immediately I was like, I'm good. Thank you. And he said, no, just listen to one episode. And so Sasquatch Chronicles is people calling up with their encounter stories. And the next day I listened to the first episode, and cut to 4 days later, I'd listened to 11 episodes. And I was not hung up on, do I believe them, the details, did they see, what did they see, what did they think they saw? What I was struck by was there was this very clear through line of visceral fear running through all these stories. And I thought that was amazing. These people sounded afraid when they were, recalling these memories. And so I started to do that dance of, your internal thing of, am I going to do this? I have to do this. People will laugh at me if I'm going to make a Sasquatch thing. I really do. I come from a real social issue, sort of doc background. And by the end of the week, I knew that I was going to do something in this sort of, Sasquatch realm, scripted or non. And I just had this thought that, wow, what if a murder mystery exists that's wrapped up in a Sasquatch story? That would be amazing. And you don't want to manufacture a story, but you think if it exists, I want to pursue it. And so David Holthouse, who is a colleague of mine who was working on Lorena with me at the time, he's been an investigative journalist for 25 plus years, and a gonzo journalist on top of that. And so he was a person who he had seen and done just a lot of really wild and dangerous things. And so, he's that friend who, if you're a filmmaker, you reach out to and say, have you ever heard of this? Or what if we could find that, And I sent him a text. It was a boring Tuesday night. And I just said, hey, this is the craziest text I'm going to send you for the next 5 years. I would love to find a murder mystery that's somehow wrapped up in a Sasquatch story. If that exists, then I want to pursue that as the next project after Lorena. And he texted me right back. He said, I love it. I got one. I'll call you in 5. And he proceeds to tell me about an experience he had in 1993. He was 23 years old, and he was a young gonzo journalist, really learning the hard way that not everybody gets to be Hunter S. Thompson. He was burning it at both ends, and he had gotten crosswise with some gangs that he was embedded with, who he was writing a piece about. This is up in Anchorage, Alaska. And even the cops told him, you need to leave. You're not safe. You need to leave town for a while. And so he reached out to a friend of his who was working on a cannabis farm in Northern California. And his friend gave him the, come on out, you'll smoke amazing weed. You take mushrooms and trip in the forest. It's beautiful. You will go home refreshed. And so, 23-year-old David is like, amazing. I'm there. Heads out there. The first omen was that it was pouring rain constantly. So, I mean, the rain was so thick he could barely even see, when he was driving. And he gets there, and the energy on this cannabis farm was just, it was palpable. And people were setting up booby traps on the perimeter. And there were these whispers about violent Sasquatch who had been coming out of the woods and sort of threatening people. And there were these hippies carrying AR-15s who were sort of guarding certain patches. So everything was just, he hadn't even gotten high yet, and everything was just, it was beyond comprehension. And so then the second night, he's sort of settled in. He's in this A-frame cabin, which is owned by the owner of the farm. And keep in mind, there are no streetlights. This A-frame cabin, it's in the middle of the woods, right? They're sitting there, they're watching Monday Night Football, they're passing around a joint, and then the phone rings. And the owner of the farm answers the phone and, mutters something back and forth with somebody. It seemed sort of loaded, sort of like a charged exchange. And then he just came and sat back down. And then about 15, 20 minutes later, the headlights of a car are sort of blasting through the front window, and it's still pouring rain. And the owner gets up, the owner of the farm gets up, lets these two guys in, and they're just, they're terrified. And they're terrified, they're out of breath. They're, clearly they have come from some sort of traumatic scenario. And what they then proceed to tell the owner that David hears while he's sitting in this chair next to his, his buddy, while they're just trying to act like they're watching TV and not notice what's going on in the background, is these guys tell the owner that there's been a murder, and it's a triple murder. And the three people, the victims, have been torn limb from limb, and their body parts are just strewn amongst this huge patch of weed, which, by the way, would have retailed for about $250,000 in '93. So whoever killed them did not take any of this product that they could sell. They annihilated these guys. And all the eyewitnesses up there have the same account, and that was that either a Bigfoot or multiple Bigfoot came out of the woods and tore these guys to pieces. And so that was the story that David told me. And so, of course, my mind was blown, and I gave him one of those like, oh man, dude, we gotta try and do this. This is crazy. It doesn't hit my heartstrings because that people were killed, because it doesn't sound real. It just sounds insane. And I want to know what happened. And he said to me, he's like, I couldn't write about this. Rolling Stone was not going to print this. This was, this is what you would get laughed at if you brought this up in to your editor. And so we knew that we were going to embark on just trying to find the source of this, sort of crazy story that seemed, 1000% implausible. And that's how it kind of kicked off.
And within that, the story takes you down a lot of roads and a lot of threads. Even though this is something that is ultimately almost 30 years ago, there's still a lot of danger around it. And so it ends up with David having a lot of conversations with people who don't appear on camera for their own safety. They're not willing to let it be known that they're even having these conversations with you. And we see moments like him on the phone, but we don't see the person on the other end. But also you utilize a lot of animation for recreation. And you've admitted that you've had a lot of reticence about the use of animation as a recreation tool in documentary, but there's this really beautiful, almost graphic novel style to it that you ended up landing upon. So how did you work yourself out of that initial hesitation of ever wanting to use that as a tool in any of your projects to that being a really core part? And then stylistically, what was it about the graphic novel telling that really excited you?
Yeah, you've nailed a few key points already. We were discussing, well, how do we visually express parts of this story that they simply don't exist, visually. There is no footage, there are no photographs. And Mark Duplass actually said, well, what about animation? And I was just like, I don't know about that. It just, I'm a 70s movie geek. You know, I like something that is real. That is what's visceral to me. And, you know, they said, well, why don't you just talk to this animator that we've worked with before. His name is Drew Christie, and he actually lives in the Pacific Northwest. And so I talked to Drew and sent him a 2-minute clip of David telling essentially, you know, the story that I just told you from that night in the cabin in the fall of '93. And maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks later, Drew sends back about 90 seconds of animation that I don't even know if a frame changed to the final version of the show. It was incredible. He captured this thing that I'd been, you know, sort of saying about this, which was that this feels less like a documentary and more of a graphic novel, you know, sort of come to life. And it was so inherent within what he had done, you know, from square one. And so, yeah, I mean, Drew, he didn't need, you know, he didn't need direction even. I wanted to see what he would just come up with on his own. And then he sort of handed us this fully realized, you know, animated world that just felt like our story. And so then it was just like, okay, one less thing to worry about. Drew's doing the animation and it's going to be cool.
And to that point as well, because you do have people who aren't appearing on camera, and there's also information that, you know, you even bleep out someone's name who's mentioned several times out of safety as well. What was that like, having that dance as a documentarian, where usually it's all about, okay, somebody said this, they said this on camera, great, we've got the information, but actually looking for spaces where it felt really necessary to omit some of the information from what you end up telling us, because that's not usually what you're looking for in documentary filmmaking?
Sure. You know, I think that was born out of sleepless nights, really, just knowing that if there were certain things that we included, people were very possibly going to be hurt or worse, you know, and not wanting to, you know, knowingly and willingly put certain people in harm's way just because I want my show to be good. You know, I mean, there are things in life that are way more important than, you know, any filmmaking pursuit. Obviously that goes without saying. And so just sort of just knowing that was the right thing to do in terms of safety for us too, even, you know. And again, I say this has more in common with a graphic novel than a doc on the surface, because some of the sort of, you know, the mechanisms that we, you know, put into play here are, you would find in the pages of a graphic novel, as opposed to the way of a piece of information would be concealed, let's say, usually, you know, in a doc. And that was just sort of exciting to me, because I just kept thinking of, you know, I'm going to give you the names of two of my favorite filmmakers, and you know, there's nothing original about these names. It's like, oh, of course I love them. It's like, you know, Fincher and Spike Jonze, you know, and I just sometimes I would say, well, what would the love child of Fincher and Spike Jonze do right here, you know? And I mean that sincerely, because, you know, just like darkness and quirk, you know, riding a fine line, you know, and just because you make this choice doesn't mean you take anything away from the moment or its authenticity. In fact, if we nail it, it will become even scarier this way than if I just, you know, cut to a picture of, you know, this person's mugshot and their whatever criminal history. There's so much about this that is, you know, rooted in sort of unknowable mystery, and just, you know, exploring the way fear is wielded and why, that all of that was kind of, you know, so, and again, I don't make these things in a vacuum. You know, it's my team with me. This is such a team game. You know, my editors, Alan Dusso, Azine Samari, Morgan Hanner, you know, I've mentioned Zach Kreger and David Holthouse, my producer partner, Stephen Berger, Elizabeth Hughes. You know, it's just like all of my DP, Ronan Colleen. It's like all of us just having what every other filmmaking team has, which is just, you know, 1,000,001 conversations where you are completely lost and you no longer know what your project is, and you're just trying to corral it while it's actually expanding and developing before your very eyes, you know. And so yeah, it was I'm glad it's over. Yeah.
And within the pursuit, you know, it takes you and David into some quite nefarious places. And I know that there were moments where you even told David not to go and have certain conversations with people about things.
Sure.
And had a system where like, it would be, okay, text me by this time so that you would know if you hadn't heard from him to be nervous. And I also heard that you tried to get security for the film, but that there was some weird resistance to security actually going with you into the woods for a lot of this. And so with that in mind, I was really interested in how you navigated the safety aspect for yourself and for your entire team with knowing the places that the story was starting to tell you and putting as much in place as you could. And again, pulling back when you really needed to.
Yeah, it was just, you know, just a lot of real-time conversations as a group. And I mean, hey, the safest thing would have been to just go home. Right. And not do it. But obviously we were not going to do that. Because we all have screws loose. That's why we want to pursue these wild stories. You know, it's just like, it's so interesting. I'm so curious. I have to know. And so, you know, it's a balance between like, you're a little kid who just, I want to know. And wait a second, that we are in some waters that are just way deeper than we are equipped for. And so just, you know, real-time conversations about, all right, what are we doing now? You know, what time, when do we leave? Maybe we shouldn't go today. That was weird. They just changed the location on you, you know? Oh, they changed the location a second time. Oh, and the time. Now it's dark out, you know? And, you know, a lot of that kind of stuff. It was nuts.
And in the way that you tell the story, and you mentioned, you know, you touched upon this just before when you were talking about how the story was really developing in your own eyes. And when you watch the series, there's no way that you could take those first 5 minutes and predict where it's going to take you in those 3 episodes. So how was that a really different journey, particularly in terms of the development process, in terms of trying to navigate and figure out what this story was potentially going to be, as opposed to where it ended up taking you once you actually started filming?
Yeah, it was interesting. You know, when I think of what my experience was like making this versus making Lorena had, you know, it had a real, there was a start and there was a beginning and an end, right? And granted, there's so much that was discovered along the way, which is just what happens when you make a doc. If you shake the tree on a particular story, you are going to find things out, you know, even if people don't want you to. I feel like that is a guarantee. But with this one, we knew where we were starting, but there was no end point. And so, yeah, we could put down on paper, you know, a sort of a dream structure or scenario, but, you know, how that was going to get filled in and develop along the way was just, you know, that was all open to things that were, you know, were chance, were unknowable. And so, you know, I mean, I mentioned before, and I mean, this is a real part of the doc process. The best doc filmmakers out there right now who, you know, they're the most famous doc filmmakers you can mention. They're making their thing. They right now have no idea what they're doing in their editing room, you know, and neither do their editors. And you know, it's like, and then you know what you're doing again. And then you don't. And so it's this crazy process where you are not leading it is leading you. And the best you can do is sort of hope to corral it. And, you know, I feel like docs, especially because it is essentially a script being written in real time and with limited story points, right? You can't just make anything up that because you cracked a way to, you know, make something work. You have to work with what you have. And at a certain point, it starts to make sense again. And you feel like you have a handle on it. And usually that is towards the very end of the process. But yeah, that, that's what makes it sort of painful and exciting. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but hopefully I said something decent.
No, you really did. And one of the things that's really successful in terms of the way that you tell this story is it's not even just about following this one potential thread. You also really look at the larger context of this community as a whole, and even going all the way back to how the war on drugs decades ago really impacted and built this really different sense of paranoia, necessity for protection. More people started to have weapon ownership because of that within the Redwoods. And so I wanted to ask you about the way in which you took this kind of insular story, but always thought about the larger context and how it fit into that throughout telling the story.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that sort of becomes revealed to you as you go on, where all of a sudden everybody you talk to says, yeah, here's what this place used to be. In the 70s, the hippies showed up. They left the Bay Area, they were done with life in the city, and they wanted to live off the land. And that included growing their own food and also growing their own weed, right? And then that kind of carried on, and this sense of community and utopia was just, it was alive, it was well, it was amazing. People had families and their schools, and people were playing music. It was just, it was incredible. And then the war on drugs starts. And where does the war on drugs go? To Northern California, and now helicopters, with people, manning these machine guns, these rifles, are now invading those hippies' communities. And what starts to happen over the course of, the next decade is, some people say, this is not what I came here for. This is not, someone's going to start firing. They're going to kill my dog. They're going to kill my kid. This is a war zone. It may look beautiful, we're in the Redwoods, but this is a literal war zone, and it's not a safe place, and I'm leaving. And they left, these folks. They went back to the Bay Area, they went to wherever they went to. And then there were the people who stayed, and they didn't double down. They quadrupled down, and now they were at war with the US government, with this literal, militarized version of law enforcement. Who had tanks and helicopters. And those people, as it was explained to us, they just went deeper and deeper and deeper into the woods. And some of them quite literally became what you can only describe as feral. And eventually, the government and the war on drugs, they left. And now you have this community of people who, they're dangerous. And if you're going to now try and go and, step onto their territory, that there is a world of, sort of nightmarish pain that you are embarking on. And it's in that world that David found himself in the fall of 1993. And he had no idea. Yeah.
And within a lot of the conversations that you have with people who have claimed sightings or even just live in the community, you really capture a lot of the emotional thread and what it really means to people as well. And also their interpersonal relationships, whether it's the two guys who are life partners and they're already bickering before they've even physically sat down because they have such different ideas of what Sasquatch is and what his capabilities are, to, the two guys that live down the road from each other, where one of them claims to have been the person in the Sasquatch costume in that really famous footage, and the other guy is like, there's absolutely no way that he did it, and they've been arguing about this for probably 40 years.
Right.
And so when you first went into filming, how aware were you of just that real emotional connectivity and the way that it informs a lot of those interpersonal relationships within the community, versus how much you discovered that as you started filming with all of them?
Yeah, I mean, you really are describing what is sort of, one of the most important things for me in a story, which is it needs to be rooted in humanity. I mean, my favorite films, many of them, they are character pieces. And so, humanity and fear and insecurity and resentment, these are things that it became really clear were, sort of through lines in a lot of this stuff, and also joy and magic and wonder, right? Bigfoot in the forest, like what? You're a hair away from maybe close encounters with some of the experiences that these people have had, and then something even more sinister sort of stomps that out. But I didn't know it was going to be there, but it is something that my ears perk up when that stuff starts to come through. That's when, like when we interviewed Wayne and George's, that's what they're the couple that you referred to, who they're Squatchers. They believe in Sasquatch, and like any good long-term romantic partnership, there's going to be some bickering about like a thing that's the thing in your life, right? And when I met those guys and sort of watched them banter back and forth, that was a moment when I thought, God, I think we really have something that is much more interesting than we thought, because there's a yearning here, that is it is squarely rooted in humanity. And really, I think for everybody, it's also about their relationship to trauma. And David talks about that, very openly, that he was sexually assaulted when he was a little boy. And years later, when he was a grown man, and David's a big guy. David's, I think David's 6'4". He is a big man. He went and hunted that guy down who sexually assaulted him when he was a little boy. And he, there's a great This American Life episode that David did, that I would, if anybody, sees this, just Google David Holthouse, This American Life. It is, it's really riveting. And, without giving too much away, hunting monsters is something that David really has done for a long time, but, both personally and professionally. And so it was when those bits of humanity started to creep in, that it felt like we were going to a place that speaks to me personally.
And you've also been very explicit about making it a point not to say out loud whether you believe in Bigfoot or whether you believe that it's a figment of imagination, that people have seen something else and thought it to be that. But that also really manifests itself in the way that you've told this story. You're never trying to tell the audience that something's true or something's not. It really is just, again, focusing on that emotional experience and the stories that people are telling you, and everybody's telling very believable stories throughout it. So why was it such an important thing for you from even the beginning of this project to never make that delineation even for yourself? And then how did you want that to manifest through the way that you told this story?
Yeah, it really goes back to my first documentary that I made. It was called Lost for Life, and it was about juveniles who are serving life in prison without parole for first-degree murders. Every single one of them committed an absolutely brutal first-degree murder when they were 17 or younger. Mostly they were 15 to 16, most of them, when they did this. And with that film, I didn't want to say, hey, this is where I come down on this issue, and now come on into my little echo chamber and let me tell you why I feel this way. I just wanted to represent their stories as they saw them, as the victims' families saw them, as people who were pro-juvenile life or anti-juvenile life saw them, and really sort of respect the audience and let them come to a determination, and it's the same thing with this one. This is not here's why Bigfoot does or doesn't exist, and this could or couldn't have happened in this way. It's like, this is what these people believe. Here's what people say happened. And you're going to do some of the work, not in a heavy lifting sort of way, but you as a viewer are going to have an opportunity to decide how you feel about everything. It's not choose your own adventure, but it's, certain things are going to hit you that you probably didn't expect to hit you. And then you'll walk away from this, hopefully, with something to talk about and discuss. I mean, those are my favorite docs, and I think that it's funny. I wasn't thinking of this when we were making it, but I was thinking of the podcast recently, S-Town, which was so incredible. I mean, that was a masterpiece. That was amazing. And just there's so much to discuss afterwards, when you're having dinner with your friends. And I hope that we made something that can do that too, where it's not like, oh, cut and dry, boom, boom, boom. He sees dead people because he was a ghost, and that's it. That worked flawlessly for The Sixth Sense. You know what I mean? And then you're retracing your steps, and what do we know? And there's endless things to talk about. But if it's a doc, if it's just here's what happened, then there's kind of nothing to discuss. I'm dancing around it because I don't want to give anything away. But there are many layers. Yeah.
And with those layers as well, how did you think about the way in which you were telling this story, not only for people who are very entrenched in this community, entrenched in these stories, are very familiar with a lot of the details, and then people who might be coming into this story for the first time as well, and making sure that it was serving both of those types of viewers?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to make something that you didn't have to be a Sasquatch enthusiast to walk into this and enjoy. It was really just treat everything that a person would think is ludicrous with integrity and with sort of gravitas. And if you do that, you will get to the compelling version. You don't make fun of the people who believe something that you think is just an absolute, fallacy. You interview them and you give them the dignity that you would somebody who is a real person who is at the center of a real case that you can see footage from the trial, on. And so I think that by taking that approach where you just treat it with respect, even though it's a Sasquatch murder mystery. I think that what you get to is that you can be a Sasquatch believer or a Sasquatch non-believer, and you're both gonna enter into a really compelling story where no one is being spoken down to.
Well, it's such an adventure in watching this series in the best way, because like I said earlier, you literally never know where the story is going to take you. And that's what's so fantastic about it. So congratulations on everything with that. And thank you so much, Josh.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.